Hello and welcome to Bud Explains, where I take a subject, be that rules, history or concept from the role-playing world and try to explain it to you in a way that I hope helps you understand how it works. Today's explanation is GRU-SV8 in Delta Green. Delta Green have always stayed close to their original mission, that much is true, and the Russian version of the organisation, Spetsliany Vedotstvo, or Special Department 8 or SV8, have done the same. However, whereas Delta Green has an aspect of plausible deniability, meaning it can be claimed to not exist at all, GRU-SV8 has official existence that is nothing more than a ghost of its previous self. GRU stands for Glavnoye Razvedyevatel Novoupnovlenie, or Chief Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff, and began as a registered directorate of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, and formed on the 21st of October 1918, at the urging of Leon Trotsky by Lenin, and they served as an intelligence service for the Red Army, collecting, collating and analysing frontline Red Army intelligence, and organised itself as a department that collected technical and scientific intelligence from foreign sources. Having never been involved in the internal policing of Russian people, officers in GRU held other state-sponsored organisations with a lowly contempt and as nothing more than pawns for the Communist Party. They've had a long-standing rivalry with other members of the Cheka, or the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, though GRU always had a subordinate position to the more politically inclined state security services. During the 1920s and 30s, the agency had a number of successful intelligence cases. However, times being the way they were, they soon became victims to the ruthless purges of Stalin. They re-emerged during World War II, and though diminished to a large extent, they rebuilt in order to face the Nazi menace. The Red Army Special Forces, or Chasti Specialnego Natsandacheriad, or Spetsnaz for short, were formed and deployed by GRU, gaining access to the German High Command and stealing atomic secrets, though continued to stay on uncertain ground until the death of Stalin, as being too successful during his regime usually ended in a purge as much as failure could. During the Cold War they flourished, and following Marshal Georgy Zhukov, two utterly corrupt KGB generals took charge, doing an incredible amount of damage to the agency during their rule from 1958 to 1987, and their corruption was usually the reason that GRU defectors to the West gave as the reason for them leaving. Eventually the Soviet military gained control of GRU, and it became led by Lieutenant General Fedor Ladygin, a former GRU officer since 1992. The GRU survived the splitting of the Soviet Union, though with a smaller operational budget, though with little in the way of changes to their structure or mission. In a fairly sad state, many of the officers and men go months without being paid, with many Spetsnaz officers taking on mercenary work or even contract killing for the Russian mafia, as well as gaining a reputation for being a broker of mercenaries due to their global contacts, with their reputation far exceeding the Red Army. GRU-SV8's first contact with the unnatural was during the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1920, when a young lieutenant of the Red Army, Gregor Studnikov, was assigned to investigate and suppress rumours of an outbreak of cannibalism. This was during the Great Famine, and desperate times did indeed call for desperate measures. However, Studnikov was to discourage those eating the dead and eliminate those who were killing Soviet citizens for this purpose, though as it stands this was the least of his problems. Those who were eating the dead in their graves were not in fact human anymore. They were devolving into monsters. Studnikov and his men killed several of them, and dozens who were mid-transformation, and burned the dead in open pits, posting guards around cemeteries. This stopped those who were in the process of devolving. However, those full ghouls simply tunnelled underneath. Studnikov reported this to Moscow, though left out anything that would make him seem crazy. This would not be his final encounter with the unnatural. While he was assigned to disaster relief around Yakutsk after the blizzard of 1927, he uncovered an Evenki cult dedicated to a pagan god known as Keturah, Lord of the Winds. He made sure that this cult was completely taken out. His investigative talents did not go unnoticed, and he was asked to join GRU in 1927. Then, in 1928, engineers excavating bunkers beneath the Kremlin found a set of catacombs that contained the lost library of Ivan the Terrible, which had been rumoured to contain a Greek translation of the Necronomicon, of which was said to contain sorcery that was used during Ivan's bloody pogroms against both real and imagined traitors. Stalin acted quickly to hide the discovery, and the plans were redrawn, with the original architects and construction crew rounded up and shot, then moved to exploit this discovery. His experiments had disastrous results that ended in 1931, though he retained the Greek Necronomicon and a partial Russian translation, as well as his interest in the occult. Leaks from the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, made GRU aware as Studnikov investigated, uncovering the disappearance of many blind Red Army veterans and inmates from mental institutions throughout the Moscow military district. Studnikov and a group of chosen GRU officers looked into whether Stalin was performing occult research and if it proved to be a threat to the security of Russia. It was noted that secrecy was of ultra importance, as spying on their great leader and his secret police could have deadly results. The GRU unit was designated Specjalny Vyedotstvo-8, or SV8 for short. Between 1931 and 1937, Studnikov worked hard to find out more about Stalin's occult power hunt, and found that in his team were a covert OGPU unit until 1934, when the NKVD assumed control, and that Stalin's team had met with zero progress. So while Stalin continued to be ineffective, SV8 were happy to observe, though stayed vigilant that they may need to get rid of their research team and wipe out their Moscow laboratory, though this mission was considered suicidal not only to the people involved, but also to GRU. As such, SV8 watched and waited. As well as observing Stalin, SV8 unearthed a number of other occult conspiracies that threatened the USSR and took them out using direct and ruthless means, though their biggest achievement was staying invisible to Stalin and the police state, a state that poured a lot in the way of resources into unearthing plots against the great leader and the USSR. However, this was all to change. In 1937, the GRU and the Red Army were decimated in Stalin's bloodiest military purge. The men of SV8 were killed, not due to being discovered, but because they were not loyal to him. There was a second purge in 1938 where every member of the Soviet General Staff were executed, as well as every GRU member over the rank of colonel. The GRU began with 45 members and only 6 remained. Included in these deaths was Studnikov, who was executed. The NKVD were also victims to Stalin's paranoia. Genrikh Yagoda, who was the chief and head of the Occult Research Project, was stripped of office in 1936, arrested in 1937 and executed in 1938. Stalin's motives were a political power play, but may have also been motivated by the lack of success in occult research. Nikolai Yezhov was made head of the project and was far more successful than Yagoda. However, by late 1938 he was removed from the position, and by February 1939 he'd been placed in a mental hospital and took his own life. Though this was not actually true, as his death was arranged by the new NKVD chief, Lavrenti Beria. The SV8 survivors laid low and slowly regrouped over the coming years, though their contact with Stalin's occult project were now gone, further complicated when Beria moved all the personnel and facilities out of Moscow. However, their attention was soon to be drawn elsewhere. Through a European spy ring known as the Red Orchestra, the GRU became aware of Nazi interest in using occult power, especially the Anna Bene, or the Ancestral Heritage and Teaching Foundation. This caused the GRU to create a department that exploited the Nazi leadership's belief in the occult for the likes of disinformation, psychological warfare, and propaganda. They reactivated SV8, mistakenly thinking that it was created to unearth espionage techniques from ancient sources. They didn't actually know what they had been created for in the first place, and nobody in GRU were involved in its creation. They decided that as SV8 was made up of officers with a background in the likes of archaeology, ancient languages and folklore, that they would be a perfect fit. The new SV8 had over 100 officers, as well as 6 of the original members who knew that the supernatural threat was very, very real. The new SV8 became operational in 1940. Initially, they were a think tank that produced psychological warfare and propaganda against the Nazi forces that also acted to bolster the Soviet morale. Though GRU-SV8 spied on the Anna Bene, discovering the RSHA and Special Unit H, who were rumoured to be using occult power to aid the war effort. Initially, SV8 kept themselves informed on Special Unit H activity via the Red Orchestra. However, in June 1942, only 4 days after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Orchestra was infiltrated and arrested by the Gestapo. During a period of horrific warfare and a series of disasters, the Red Army suffered millions of casualties, seemingly unable to stop the Nazi juggernaut that advanced without compromise. GRU and SV8 continued to perform their duties, and during the siege of Leningrad, reports from the front line filtered back of incidents of cannibalism, with some reports being that subhumans were consuming humans. GRU-SV8 examined the evidence and learned that it was the same mutants that Gregor Studnikov had observed in Siberia that were appearing in the city. GRU-SV8 set to work eliminating the cannibals and burned all of those that showed devolution symptoms, all the while keeping an ear to the ground as to reports elsewhere of similar situations. However, while dealing with these revelations, GRU-SV8 uncovered an old enemy in a new disguise. Okay, that concludes part 1 in this series. The next video will cover SMERSH and the Karatechia. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like and share it, and make sure to subscribe for more Bud Explains videos in the future. Bud out.